There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a big piece of land when the person who loved it most is gone. It is not the quiet of peace. It is not the quiet of rest. It is a heavier thing altogether, the kind that fills up every room, every barn stall, every stretch of fence line until even the wind seems to move apologetically. Like a guest who arrived too late to the funeral and does not know quite where to stand. Caleb Horn had known that kind of quiet before. He had carried it with him for 3 years across the territory of Wyoming, drifting from one hired job to the next, never staying long enough to let a place mean something to him again. He had learned, through hard experience, that meaning was just grief waiting to introduce itself. So when a man at the Broken Bit Saloon in Carthorne told him that a widow woman named Margaret Greer was looking to hire a ranch hand, permanent work, fair wages. A bunk in the South Barn, Caleb almost said no. Almost, but 3 days without a solid meal and the particular way October cold bites through a worn coat have a way of rearranging a man's priorities. He rode out to the Greer place on a gray Tuesday morning following directions scratched on a tobacco wrapper. He expected a modest operation, maybe 40 acres, a house needing paint. A few head of cattle and a widow who needed wood split and a leaking roof patched before winter. What he found was something else entirely. The Greer ranch rolled out before him like a sentence that refused to end. The land climbed and fell and climbed again, stretching northwest toward a ridge of blue mountains that caught the morning light and held onto it the way some people hold onto hope, carefully. Like it might break. The pastures were wide and golden, the fences ran straight and long, there were cattle grazing in the south meadow, not a few but many. The main house was a large 2-story timber structure with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. Behind it stood a big red barn, 2 smaller outbuildings, a bunkhouse, and a windmill that turned slowly in the October breeze. Caleb sat on his horse at the end of the drive and stared. And then a woman came out onto the porch, shielded her eyes against the gray sky, and looked at him steadily. He took off his hat out of habit. She did not wave, she simply waited. He rode up, stepped down from his horse, and said the first honest thing that came into his head. "Ma'am, I came about the hand position. But I have to tell you straight, your ranch is too big for one man." The woman was silent for a moment. Her eyes were dark and still, the way deep well water is still. Then she said so quietly he almost missed it in the wind, "Then stay and take care of it, and me." She turned and went back inside before he could answer. And somehow that was where everything began. Carthorne, Wyoming was the kind of town that remembered everything and forgave very little. It sat in a wide valley between 2 long ridges, close enough to the new rail line to benefit from the commerce it brought, but far enough away to still feel like the old country. There was a church with a white steeple that leaned slightly east, a general store run by the Aldred family. A sheriff's office that was almost always locked because Sheriff Dawes preferred to conduct his business from a chair on the front steps, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, a small school. And approximately 400 people who knew each other's business with a thoroughness that would have impressed the Pinkerton agency. The Greer Ranch sat 6 miles north of town, and the story of Margaret Greer was known to every one of those 400 people in the way that sad stories always are, thoroughly, lovingly. And with certain liberties taken in the telling. What was true was this. Margaret Greer, born Margaret Ann Calloway in Missouri, had come to Wyoming at 22 with her husband, Thomas Greer, who had been a determined and broadly capable man with a gift for reading land. Thomas had spent 15 years building that ranch from nothing. He had carved pasture from scrubland, dug irrigation channels by hand, driven cattle north when others said it could not be done, and built the house board by board with his own hands and the help of 3 hired men. Thomas Greer died of a fever in the spring of 1889. He had been 44 years old. Margaret had been 41. She had no children. Thomas's brother in Colorado had written twice suggesting she sell the property and come live near his family. Margaret had not written back, she had simply stayed. That was 3 years ago. Now she was 44, alone on a ranch that would have challenged a crew of 6, managing it with a stubbornness that Carthorne alternately admired and pitied, depending on who you asked and what mood the week was in. Caleb Horn was 38. He was not a large man, but he was built the way good tools are built, without waste. He had brown hair going gray at the temples, a face that the weather had been working on for 2 decades, and blue eyes that were the only soft thing about him at first glance. He had grown up in Kansas, lost a wife to childbirth when he was 26, and had been moving ever since, not running exactly but not stopping either. He had worked cattle drives, mended fences for a lumber operation in Montana, spent 6 months as a deputy in a town he preferred not to name, and done various other work that kept his hands busy and his thoughts occupied enough not to be dangerous. He was, as he had once described himself to a bartender in Cheyenne, a man with no particular destination. What Caleb did not expect, what he was wholly unprepared for, was Margaret Greer. Not her appearance, though she was a handsome woman with the kind of composure that grief and hard work together build in certain people. What he was unprepared for was the quality of her attention. When Margaret Greer looked at you, she looked at you the way a good reader looks at a page, carefully, without rushing, as though she intended to understand what was actually written there, and not just what the words said on the surface. She gave him a brief walkthrough of the property that first morning, speaking in plain, measured sentences. These are the pastures, these are the cattle, 231 head. This is the south barn where you would sleep. This is what I pay, this is what I expect. She did not apologize for the size of the work, she did not make small talk. She did not smile until they reached the windmill, and then only because it made a peculiar grinding sound at the top of its rotation that she told him Thomas had always said sounded like a man trying to whistle with a mouthful of biscuit. It was such an unexpected thing to say that Caleb laughed out loud, and Margaret looked briefly surprised, as though she had not quite intended to share that particular memory and was uncertain how she felt about having done so. He took the job. He told himself it was the pay and the roof over his head and the approaching winter. He was not entirely wrong. The first weeks passed in the slow rhythm of hard, honest work. Caleb threw himself into the ranch the way a man does when the labor is good and the land rewards attention. There was plenty to do. 3 sections of fence along the north pasture were failing. A water channel had silted up. 2 of the outbuildings needed their roofs re-nailed before snow came. The cattle needed moving to the lower pastures. The barn needed a new door hinge that was the size of a man's forearm. He worked from gray light to gray light and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not mind it. Margaret worked too. That was something he had not expected, though perhaps he should have. She was not the sort of woman to stand on a porch and direct. She rode her own horse, a dark bay mare named Ruth, out to the pastures every morning. She could mend a fence almost as quickly as he could. She kept meticulous records in a leather ledger that lived on the kitchen table. And she made decisions about the cattle operation with a clear-headed confidence that told him she had been learning this business for a very long time. They worked mostly in parallel those first weeks, not avoiding each other exactly, but not seeking each other out either. There was a natural propriety to their interactions that neither of them had discussed and both of them understood, but land has a way of bringing people together. There is too much of it to tend alone. The first time they worked side by side for a full day was on the north fence repair. It was early November by then, cold enough to see your breath, the sky the color of an old pewter spoon. They worked for 6 hours without stopping, pulling wire, setting posts, and speaking in the practical shorthand of shared physical work. Hand me the pliers, hold that post straight. This wire is going to snap, stand back. At noon, she produced biscuits and salted beef from her saddlebag, and they sat on the tailgate of the work wagon and ate without ceremony. After a while she said, "Where were you before here, Montana last? Before that, Cheyenne. You move around." "I do." She looked at the fence line. "Thomas used to say that land is the only thing that stays put, everything else moves eventually." smart man, he was, a pause. He was also stubborn as a fence post and wrong about horses half the time, but he was smart. Caleb looked at her. She was not sad when she said it, she was precise. She was describing a real man, not a polished memory. How long ago? He asked. 3 years in April. I'm sorry, people keep saying that. She looked at him directly. I don't think they know what else to say. Probably not. What do you say when you don't know what to say? He thought about it. Nothing, usually. I find nothing is usually more honest. She considered that for a moment. Then she nodded once as though he had passed some small, unannounced test and handed him another biscuit. That was, he would think later, the afternoon things shifted, not dramatically, not in the way that songs describe a shift, just quietly. The way light changes in the late afternoon without you noticing until suddenly the shadows are longer and the world looks different than it did an hour ago. Over the following weeks, those conversations became a natural part of the days, not long conversations, not sentimental ones, but real ones. She told him about the early years of the ranch when she and Thomas had lived in a one-room structure where the barn now stood. He told her about Kansas carefully, leaving out the parts that still hurt too directly. She told him that she had wanted children and it had not happened, and she had made her peace with it, which he suspected was not entirely true but respected nonetheless. He told her he had a brother in Ohio he hadn't written to in 4 years, and she said, "Write him," and he said, "Maybe," and she said, "Write him." Caleb, in a tone that did not leave much room for maybe. He wrote his brother that weekend. He did not tell her he had done it, but she noticed the envelope in his coat pocket when he rode into Carthorne for supplies, and she did not say a word about it. She simply looked at him with an expression he was beginning to learn, a slight softening around the eyes. A contained satisfaction that meant she was pleased and did not intend to make a production of it. Carthorne, however, was not so restrained. Small towns in Wyoming in 1892 did not require much material to construct an elaborate story. The raw ingredients could be minimal. A hired hand, a widow, a ranch 6 miles out of town, weekly supply trips where the two of them were sometimes seen arriving together and sometimes not, that was quite enough. The conversation at the Aldred General Store had, by Caleb's 3rd week in Carthorne, reached a level of detail and moral complexity that surprised him given how little had actually occurred. Dora Aldred, who ran the store while her husband managed the books in the back room, and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of everyone within 20 miles, told anyone who browsed her shelves long enough that she worried about Margaret Greer. That she thought it was not quite appropriate for a widow of Margaret's standing to have a strange man living on her property with no one else present. That Thomas Greer had been a pillar of this community, and his widow deserved better than to be the subject of talk. The irony that Dora was the primary generator of the talk was not something Dora appeared to consider. The pastor's wife, a thin woman named Eunice Marsh, had twice visited the ranch on what she described as a social call, but which Caleb privately assessed as an inspection. Margaret received her both times with perfect courtesy and a plate of ginger cookies, and offered nothing whatsoever that could be used as evidence of impropriety, which Eunice found both admirable and deeply frustrating. The real pressure came from a man named Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch was 49, prosperous, and had ranching operations to the east of town that were half the size of the Greer property and twice as noisy about it. He was a widower himself with grown children in Denver, and he had been what the town politely called an admirer of Margaret Greer for going on 2 years. He had made his interest known in the formal, deliberate way of a man accustomed to acquiring things through persistent negotiation, visits, offers to assist with the ranch operation, suggestions that a partnership would benefit them both, and on 2 occasions something approaching a proposal of marriage that Margaret had deflected with the same composed, unhurried finality with which she did most things. Gerald Fitch did not take to Caleb Horn's presence kindly. He made his feelings known at the Broken Bit Saloon one Friday evening in November, in the way that men of his type tend to make things known in saloons loudly to an audience. And with the confidence of a man who believes he controls the room. Drifter, he said, that is the word. A drifter who showed up broke and hungry, and Margaret Greer, God bless her, is too soft-hearted to see what she's invited onto her land. Caleb was in the saloon that evening. He had ridden in for supplies and stopped for one drink on the way back, which was his habit on Fridays. He heard every word. He finished his drink. He set the glass down carefully. He looked at Gerald Fitch across the room. A man is what his work shows, Caleb said quietly but clearly. You're welcome to come out and look at the north fence line. It was not a challenge exactly, it was a statement, which was somehow worse in Gerald Fitch's estimation. The room watched. Gerald Fitch said, my concern is not the fence line. I know what your concern is, Caleb said, but that's not mine to manage. He paid for his drink and walked out. He rode back to the ranch in the dark, the cold settling into his coat, and did not mention the exchange to Margaret. But in the small, interconnected world of Carthorne, she heard about it by the following Monday. She came out to the barn where he was working on the door hinge and stood in the doorway for a moment. I heard you were in the saloon Friday, she said. Yes, I heard what Gerald said. Caleb kept working. It is not your problem, Margaret. It is very much my problem, she said, without heat but with clarity. This is my ranch and you are my employee, and what people say about this place reflects on me and on you both. Do you understand that? He set down the hinge. Yes, ma'am, she looked at him steadily. I don't need you fighting my battles, Caleb. I wasn't fighting anything, I was stating a fact. A pause. Something moved across her face that he could not quite read. Then she said, Gerald Fitch has been trying to acquire this ranch for 2 years. Sometimes through courtship and sometimes through other means. He is not a man who accepts no gracefully. I had that impression. I want you to know that his interest in what happens here has nothing to do with concern for my well-being. I know that too, she nodded. Good, she turned to go, then stopped. For what it is worth, Caleb, the north fence line is the best work this ranch has seen in 3 years. She walked back to the house. He stared at the barn door for a long moment, then he picked up the hinge and went back to work. December came in hard and beautiful, the way Wyoming winters do, without warning or apology. Laying white over everything and making the world look clean and uncomplicated in a way that was entirely misleading. The work shifted with the season. The cattle needed more tending, the horses more feed, the water channels monitoring for ice. The house itself needed weatherproofing. Caleb spent 3 days sealing gaps in the timber framing, replacing worn shingles, banking the exterior walls with straw bales against the cold. He was inside the house more now necessarily for that work. And that proximity to Margaret's daily life, to the smell of coffee in the morning, to the sound of her moving through rooms, to the ordinary and continuous evidence of how she lived, was doing something to him that he did not care to examine too directly. He liked her, that much he could acknowledge to himself without undue alarm. He respected her enormously. He found her company more pleasant than any company he had sought out in years. But there was a line that he understood to exist, and he understood why it existed, and he had no intention of crossing it. There were reasons beyond the practical ones, beyond the fact that she was his employer, beyond the town's watchful eyes, beyond the shadow of Gerald Fitch's interest. Caleb Horn had loved a woman once and lost her, and the loss had done something to his architecture. Not broken him exactly, but rearranged him in ways that made certain rooms feel permanently closed off. He was 38 years old, and he had spent 12 of those years making his peace with solitude, and most days, solitude seemed like a sufficient arrangement. Most days. The evening that changed his understanding of his own situation came in the second week of December. During a snowstorm that arrived at dusk and settled in for the night with the comfortable permanence of a bad habit. He had finished battening down the barn and come to the house to return a tool he had borrowed from the kitchen, and Margaret had said, with the simple practicality that characterized most of what she did, Don't ride back to the bunkhouse in this. Sit down, I've got soup. They ate at the kitchen table by lamplight, the wind pushing hard against the windows. She had a book open beside her bowl, a habit he had learned left over from her girlhood, and read a few lines between bites which should have felt rude and somehow did not. He drank his coffee and listened to the storm. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked up from the book. Why did you stay after Thomas? This place it is a lot of land for one person. Anyone would have understood if you'd sold it. She was quiet for a moment. When she answered, she looked at the lamp rather than at him. Because he built it, she said. Because I watched him build every foot of it. Because I know exactly how many steps it is from the front porch to the south barn, and I know that number because he and I walked it together every evening for 15 years. A pause. I could not sell someone else Thomas's steps. Caleb did not say anything. And because, she continued more quietly, I thought if I stayed I would keep learning how to be the person he believed I was. He looked at her then, directly. In the lamplight, and felt something move in him that he had not felt in a very long time. Not a rush or a fire, but something quieter and more unsettling, like a door in that rearranged architecture shifting on its hinges. He was right to believe it, Caleb said. She looked at him. Whatever kind of person he thought you were, Caleb said carefully, he was right. Margaret set down her spoon. She looked at him with those still, deep eyes. And he saw something there that she normally kept further back, a kind of longing that she had been living with so long it had become simply part of her face. Visible only when she wasn't guarding against it. Caleb, she said. I'm sorry, he said immediately. I overstepped. No, she said, you didn't. She paused. That is rather the problem. They sat with that for a while. The storm continued outside. The lamp burned steadily. He excused himself shortly after, buttoning his coat and walking back through the snow to the bunkhouse, and he lay awake on his narrow bunk listening to the wind and understanding. With a clarity that felt like a cold hand on his chest, that he was in territory far more complicated than fence lines and cattle counts. The letter arrived in January. Caleb brought it back from Carthorne on a Tuesday along with the weekly supplies. He handed it to Margaret in the kitchen without looking at the return address and then went to attend to the horses. He was in the barn an hour later when she came to find him. He knew from the way she walked, the particular set of her shoulders, that something was wrong. It's from Gerald Fitch's lawyer, she said. She held the letter like it was a thing she would prefer to put down somewhere but could not find the right place. He is making a formal claim that a portion of the north pasture boundary, approximately 40 acres along the ridge, was incorrectly surveyed when Thomas recorded the deed in 78. He is saying the land belongs to his holdings. Caleb straightened. Does it? No, her voice was flat and certain. It does not. Thomas surveyed that line himself, and he had it witnessed by 3 men, one of whom was the county recorder. But his lawyer is saying the original survey documentation was lost in a fire at the county office in 84. Was it? There was a fire at the county office. She looked at the letter. I don't know what survived. Caleb came out of the stall. Where is the original deed? In Thomas's strongbox in the study, and the survey papers. The witnessed ones? She was quiet for a moment. He kept meticulous records. There should be survey notes in his ledgers, but I have not gone through every page. There are 6 years of ledgers I have not. She stopped. He understood. 6 years of Thomas's handwriting that she had not been able to make herself read. Margaret, he said gently. We need to look. She pressed her lips together. I know. They sat in the study that evening, a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper and the particular absence of the man who had inhabited it, and went through Thomas Greer's ledgers. Together. Margaret began the first one, and within 3 pages had gone very still. Caleb watched her for a moment, then simply moved his chair closer and kept working on the stack beside her, not commenting, not looking at her directly, simply present. After a while she drew a slow breath and continued reading. They found what they needed in the 4th ledger. Thomas had made detailed survey notes in his methodical hand, including the date, the names of the witnesses, the measurements, and a hand-drawn boundary map with compass bearings. At the bottom of the entry, in different ink and a different hand, one of the witnesses evidently was a countersignature and a date. Margaret put her finger on it very carefully as though it might vanish. "There," she said. Caleb leaned over to look. "That is the North Ridge line, yes, and this signature, Elias Morrow. He was Thomas's neighbor to the west. He died in '86, but his son still runs the property." She looked up. "His son would remember. Then we have it." Caleb sat back. "This, the deed, and a witness testimony from Morrow's son. A lawyer in Cheyenne could make a very clean case." Margaret looked at the page a moment longer. Then she closed the ledger slowly and held it in her lap. "He wrote about the north fence," she said quietly. "In this ledger, he wrote about how he planned to extend it in the spring." She stopped. "He wrote that when the north pasture was secured, he was going to build a better road to the ridge so we could ride up there evenings in summer." The lamplight was steady and warm. Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say. After a long while, Margaret lifted her eyes to his. "Thank you," she said, "for not leaving me to do this alone." It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of 3 years of doing everything alone, and he felt that weight and he held it with her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. He had not planned to say it. He was not entirely sure what he meant by it, but having said it, he found that it was true. The legal matter was resolved by late February, with considerably less drama than Gerald Fitch had anticipated. Caleb rode to Cheyenne with the ledger and the deed and returned with a lawyer named Simmons who had close-cropped gray hair and a quiet, methodical manner that suited the situation perfectly. Daniel Morrow, Elias' son, confirmed his father's witness signature without hesitation. Simmons wrote 3 letters and the claim was withdrawn. Gerald Fitch did not respond gracefully. There was a scene at the general store in early March that the town of Carthorne would discuss with considerable enjoyment for the rest of the year, in which Gerald made remarks about Caleb's character that were loud enough for Dora Aldred and 2 customers to hear clearly. And Caleb once again declined to engage with anything more than measured calm, which infuriated Gerald far more than any heated response would have. But something else happened in that period, something slower and quieter and more significant than any legal claim, having sat together in that study, having gone through Thomas's ledgers side by side, having held that particular grief together in the lamplight. Something between Caleb and Margaret had changed in the way that things change when 2 people share a real and private moment. Not shifted toward romance exactly, not yet, but shifted toward a kind of honesty that was its own form of closeness. She started leaving his coffee on the kitchen step in the morning rather than on the porch rail. He started noticing which fence sections she found particularly difficult to manage alone, and quietly ensured he was available for those without being asked. She began telling him things about Thomas not as memories she needed to manage, but as stories she wanted to tell, funny ones, difficult ones, true ones. He began telling her about his wife Ellen, things he had not said aloud in years, and found that speaking them in this woman's careful presence did not break anything. It lightened something. But they were both careful people. Careful in the way that people become when they have been hurt by life and have learned to move gently in the vicinity of things they value. And there was the town. There was always the town. Eunice Marsh visited a 3rd time in March and made comments of such pointed circumlocution about the importance of propriety that even Margaret, who had the patience of a woman who had spent winters alone, finally said with a pleasantness so precise it bordered on surgery, "Eunice, I value your concern, and I would value it even more if it were expressed with somewhat more directness. What exactly is it that you would like me to do?" Eunice left shortly after and reported to Dora Aldred that Margaret Greer had become, she was sorry to say, quite changed. The tension in Carthorne about the situation had that particular quality of communal discomfort that occurs when a community cannot decide whether to be scandalized or pleased. Margaret Greer was respected too much to be treated unkindly. But old habits of expectation die hard. And a 44-year-old widow living and working daily alongside a man of 38 without benefit of any formal arrangement was a situation that occupied significant space in the town's moral imagination. What pushed Caleb to act finally, clumsily, honestly was not the town's opinion and was not a dramatic moment. It was a Saturday morning in late March when the snow was finally retreating and the first suggestion of green was appearing in the lower pastures. And he was mending a section of the south pasture fence while Margaret worked 50 yards away on another section, and he looked up and saw her in the early spring light, coat open. Hair loosened from its braid by the wind, completely absorbed in her work, and felt a clarity about his own situation that was simply undeniable. He put down his tools and walked over to her. She looked up. "Margaret," he said. "Yes," he took a breath. "I need to say something and I would like you to hear it out before you respond." She straightened and looked at him with that full, careful attention of hers. "I came here to do a job," he said. "And I intend to keep doing it well. That is not what I am talking about." He looked at the fence post between them, then back at her. "I am talking about the fact that somewhere along the way I stopped being a man passing through, and I need you to know that. I am not asking anything of you. I am not saying anything that needs an answer today. I am only saying that I am here and I intend to stay, and not because of the wage." Margaret looked at him for a long time. The wind moved across the pasture and carried the smell of wet earth and grass beginning. "I know," she said at last. "I have known for some time. And I am frightened," she said plainly. "I am not a young woman, Caleb. I am not under any illusion about what I am or what this life is. I'm not a young man. That is not the same, and you know it." "No," he said honestly, "it is not. But I am not asking you to pretend anything. I am asking you to not decide against it simply because it frightens you." She was quiet. "I am frightened too," he added. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something unguarded and young and a little raw. "You are more than I'd like to admit in decent company," he said. And Margaret Greer, who had managed 231 head of cattle and a legal dispute and 3 years of solitude without a tremor of public emotion, smiled, not a polite smile. A real one, wide and sudden and completely unguarded. It was, Caleb thought, the finest thing he had seen in 12 years. Spring came into Wyoming the way it always does, not all at once, but in arguments, some warm days defeated by late cold snaps, the land debating with itself. And then finally one morning you wake up and the meadows are properly green and the decision has been made without any particular announcement. The Greer Ranch came alive in that spring with a quality of life it had not quite had before. Caleb extended the north pasture fence all the way to the ridge, the way Thomas's ledger had said he planned to. He did not mention that to Margaret. She noticed it and did not mention it to him either. Some things are understood better without words. He wrote to his brother in Ohio again. His brother wrote back. The letters were short and a little awkward, the way letters between people who have been distant for too long tend to be, but they were real, and they continued. Gerald Fitch made no further claims on the land or on Margaret's attention, having apparently recalculated the returns on that particular investment. He was not spoken of much. The thing about men who are primarily motivated by acquisition is that when the acquisition proves unavailable, they tend to find other interests efficiently. Dora Aldred, in a turn of character that surprised everyone including herself, became one of Margaret's more reliable allies after a conversation in early April in which Margaret quietly told her, over coffee in the back of the store, that she was grateful for community concern but that she was a grown woman of 44 who had built a working ranch out of Wyoming dirt. And that she believed she was capable of managing her own life with reasonable competence. Dora, who respected competence above almost everything, took this well. She did not stop talking, that was not within her capability, but the quality of what she said shifted measurably. Eunice Marsh remained Eunice Marsh. It was on a Sunday in May that Caleb Horn and Margaret Greer rode up to the North Ridge together for the first time. The view from there was remarkable. The whole of the ranch spread below them, the pastures dark green now, the cattle moving slowly in the lower meadows. The house and barn looking small and solid and permanent. The mountains to the northwest were still carrying snow on their upper faces, and the light was the long, golden, generous light of late afternoon. They sat on their horses for a while without talking, then Margaret said, "Thomas always said he would build a road up here." "I know," Caleb said. She looked at him. "I read it," he said. "In his ledger. The night we were going through them, and you extended the fence to the ridge. The grass up here is good." She looked at him with that clear-eyed steadiness that he had come to understand was not judgment but its opposite, a willingness to see clearly and accept what was there. "I am still frightened," she said. "I know, but I am also," she paused, choosing the word the way she chose most things, carefully. "I am also not willing to let fear be the whole answer. No, no," she looked at the ranch below. "Thomas used to say that land is the only thing that stays put. Everything else moves." She paused. "I think he was almost right. I think land stays put, and I think people can choose to." Caleb looked at her. "I am not asking you to be Thomas," she said. "I would not want that. I am asking if you meant what you said about staying." "I meant it," he said. "I mean it now." She nodded. She looked at the mountains. "Then I suppose we had better build that road." It was not a declaration of love in the way that songs would have it. It was something more like two people who had both lived in the country of grief and solitude agreeing with open eyes and reasonable courage to try something different. He reached across the space between their horses and held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then she placed her hand in his. They stayed on the ridge until the sun touched the mountains, and then they rode back down together to the ranch that was, by any honest assessment, still too big for one person to tend alone. By the end of that summer, Carthorne had found new things to talk about. There was a wedding, quiet and small, at the church with the eastward-leaning steeple in October. The pastor officiated. Dora Aldred brought 2 pies. Daniel Morrow came down from his property and shook Caleb's hand with the particular warmth of a man glad to see justice extend itself into something good. Even Eunice Marsh came, because she was not a bad woman, only a careful one. And she could see plainly enough what had grown between these two people and had the good sense to recognize it for what it was. The Greer Ranch, people called it the Greer Horn Place now, and Margaret had no objection to that, continued to operate with the steady, purposeful rhythm of a place that was properly cared for. The cattle were healthy, the fences held, the water channels ran clear. The windmill on the hill turned in the breeze and made its peculiar grinding sound, and now there were 2 people who smiled when they heard it. In the spring of the following year, Caleb finished the road up to the North Ridge. It was a modest road, packed earth and gravel, wide enough for a wagon, but it was solid and it went where it was supposed to go. The first evening it was finished, Margaret packed a supper basket and they drove up in the wagon and sat on the tailgate and ate as the sun went down behind the mountains. "She said he would have liked you," Caleb said. "I think I would have liked him. He would have argued with you about horses, probably, and fence posts. Most men do." She leaned her shoulder against his. "He would have been glad," she said. "That someone is here." Caleb looked out over the ranch, the pastures going gold in the evening light, the smoke rising from the chimney. The horses moving along the south fence, and felt something he had not felt in so long he had almost stopped believing it was something a person could feel again. He felt at home, not the home of the place where you were born, the better kind. The kind you find by moving in the right direction long enough and then one day standing still and discovering that where you stopped is exactly where you were supposed to be. There is a thing about big land and the people who choose to stay with it. It will ask more of you than seems fair. It will test the limits of what one person can carry. It will be on certain gray November mornings when the wind is down and the work is heavy and the quiet presses in too much. And that is exactly the truth that lies at the heart of this story. Not that love solves the bigness. Not that another person makes the hard work disappear or fills the space left by a good man gone too soon. But that two people who have both learned to carry heavy things can sometimes look at each other across a stretch of Wyoming grass and decide, with their eyes open and their fears acknowledged, that carrying together is better than carrying alone. Caleb Horn arrived at the Greer Ranch broke and purposeless and said the most honest thing he knew how to say. And Margaret Greer, who had been tending that land and that grief by herself for 3 long years, whispered something that was not just an offer of employment. It was an offer of trust. From a woman who had very good reason to be careful about such things to a man who had very good reason to keep moving, they were both brave enough to stop. That perhaps is the finest thing either of them ever did. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Rusted Saddle Stories. If this tale settled somewhere in your chest the way a good fire warms a cold room, we are glad for that. These are the kinds of stories we love most, quiet ones, true ones. The kind where ordinary people on ordinary land make the kind of choices that change the rest of their lives. If you are new to this channel, we are glad you found your way here. And if you have been writing with us for a while, you know there is always another story waiting just down the road. Until next time, friends, keep writing.